Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're just going to start in a couple of minutes. Well, I guess since it's 35, we can start with the crash course. So I hope you can all hear me well and that you can see my screen. And yeah, the crash course is about regulating the digital. So I didn't prepare a summary of the course, but more some guidelines and advice on how to write the paper. So the presentation is quite short, but it leaves you a lot of time to ask questions, and maybe like if you want to ask something about the paper, if it makes sense, if you have any questions, we can keep that for the end. So just in short, what is a policy brief? Well, it's normative, so it says what should and needs to be done. So you're going to choose a problem that is important and relevant in society, and then you're going to explain why it's a problem and why it needs to be tackled by a policy. And yeah, so you can follow different guidelines. And first of all, when you're going to start with a policy analysis, so you're going to think about what is the problem and especially why is it a problem. And then you're going to look for evidence to prove that it's actually a problem and it actually affects people and so on. And you also need to think about where this problem comes from. So what are the roots of the problem? And who are the stakeholders that are negatively affected by it? And you can also think about, okay, what if we don't do anything, what are the consequences of it not taking action? And once you have a good framework of what the problem is, you're going to think about different policy options. So you're going to think what kind of options can be considered. And then you dig into it. You're going to look like in detail, what do they look like? What are the benefits or the strengths, but also the weaknesses and the drawbacks of such policy options. And also you're going to have to think a lot about which stakeholders do they benefit, but we're going to talk about this a bit later. And once you present a solution, a policy solution, first you're going to have to describe in detail, and then again analyze the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and so on, and also evaluate. So you cannot just simply describe, but you also have to dig deeper into what the policy actually means. And yeah, so when you think about what is a good option, you can consider different aspects. For instance, the financial cost. You also have to think about how effective it is, how it responds to stakeholder needs. So you also have to think, okay, this is not something I want, but this needs to actually respond to the needs of society. So obviously cannot respond to every stakeholder needs, but still it cannot be just like a personal opinion. And also the fairness is very important. So you're going to have to define why it's a fair option. And by defining fair, you're also going to come in relation to the point of equality and equity. So maybe your recommendation is giving a little push to some minorities or people that are disadvantaged, and you're going to have to explain why giving more advantages to certain groups is actually fairness. And yeah, the popularity is also related to the response to stakeholder needs. So if you implement it, you also have to think about it, if people are going to be happy about it, if, yeah, what is the popular opinion on this? And also if it conforms to international norms. So again, norms are something normative, something that it should be done. And yeah, the speed of response is also very important. So you cannot, I mean, you have to plan long term as well, but it also have to have some effect in the short term. And the language you can use is also very important. So you always have to keep this in mind, what is needed and what should be done. So I think that's really the questions you should ask yourself throughout when you write a paper. And yeah, you can also talk about actions. So what actions does the situation call for? What are appropriate measures, steps? And most importantly, you can also think about the list of concepts and terms that you had to define during the course. So you had a glossary. And I think you can use those terms. So just making the word appear, it's already going to give you a lot of points. And yeah, now regarding the structure of the paper, you're going to have to start with an executive summary that gives you the context. So you're going to have to explain shortly what the problem is. And again, why it's very repetitive, I'm sorry, but why is it a problem? And just so, yeah, give a societal context. And then also you have to give the purpose and outline of the report. So describe a little bit the structure, but also like what are you aiming at? So I think it's important to say both, that you're trying to inform, but also prescribe some action. And then you have to explain like why this objective is important. And then as every paper, you have to introduce the problem. So you're going to give a research context. And I think that giving definitions is also very important in a policy brief. So what I did, for example, I had small figures with just like the definition of the main concepts. And once the context and the definitions are clear, you're going to dig into the problem and explain yeah, the roots of the problem, where this problem come from. So for instance, I wrote about gender equality and bias in AI. So explaining where the problem comes from, then I had to talk about gender equality and the feminist movement. So give a little bit of a historical background. And it's also important to give evidence for the problem. So what helps is to look at reports, for instance, the United Nations, the UNESCO, but also the European Union do a lot of research on problems, especially related to digital technologies. So if you just type these keywords on their website, you're going to find some reports, and you can use these reports for like the evidence of the problem. And in the last part of your introduction, you have to elaborate on who the stakeholders are, so who is involved. And you also have to think about what kind of relationships they have. So I would suggest you to start with kind of a list and be like, okay, this, you have the public sector, the private sector, elaborate a bit on that. And then you can also think in the public sector, the different categories, for instance, more the municipality, the legislation part, and then also see, okay, how does the private sector collaborate with the municipality in that things. For instance, if you think about smart cities, and in Eindhoven, that Philips is a very important stakeholder. So yeah, really think about how they collaborate and why also this collaboration is important. And the next part of your policy brief is to frame a good solution. So you'll have to explain why is it important to push the issue, and elaborate on the risk. So if you don't push this issue, what is going to happen? So in case you're talking about inequalities in AI or bias in algorithmic decision making, that kind of things, if you don't tackle them now, it's going to get worse, and these inequalities are going to get reinforced. So that is why it's important to push the issue. And why is this a favorable moment to push the issue? You have to give a little bit of context. So it's easier if you take a problem like a digital technologies that recently had some issues, or like if you have some press articles, for instance, yeah, GDPR it's always like a favorable moment to push the issue because there are always some problems with privacy. But same if you take the case of like if you look at all these reports, and you can take a scandal or something, that's gonna explain better why this is a favorable moment to push the issue. And then you're also gonna have to think about what kind of dilemma you're facing. For instance, when I was writing about gender equality, one of the dilemmas is defining what is gender, and the constant reshaping, or the current reshaping of the definition of what is a man, what is a woman. So that is a dilemma that you can think about. And yeah, again, think about what kind of impacts the regulation will have. So who is it going to impact? Who is it going to include and exclude? And if other types of impacts are, for example, the risk of impeding innovation and growth. So if you're talking about something that is closely related to innovation, if you regulate it too strongly, it's going to have negative impact. And maybe one of the impact could be that that some companies will move to foreign countries, which is going to have a negative effect on the national economy, and people are going to lose their job, that kind of things. And also, I think that two important things to include when you think about a solution, you have to highlight the fact that there is no, or like that a lot of regulation tend to fall the one size fits all bias, so that you're going to have one solution for a lot of problems, even though a lot of problems are very different. And that's why you should like think about different solutions for different problems. And lastly, I think that the human right approach is also something very important. So for most of the issues with digital technologies, they're related to human rights, which are a lot of things. So for instance, equality, privacy, fairness, inclusion, all those things are human rights. And when you frame a solution, try to frame it from a human right approach. So it's also going to be easier to explain why it's important to push this issue. And the next part is the synthesis and recommended tools. So you're going to have to be creative and recommend a tool or several tools that could solve the issue you've been mentioning all along the policy brief. And for us, it was very important to build upon existing policies and regulations. So again, you can go to the European Union website, and there you're going to have a lot of lots of information about existing policies. And usually if you go at the end of the papers, they also explain you, okay, what still needs to be done. So you can build upon those recommendations as well. And you have to explain shortly why this specific recommendation is the one you chose and not another. So you can also compare the available options and then be like, okay, this is better because of that and that. And it's important also to focus on the local, national, international level, intergovernmental policy. So you have to make it clear, like for who is this policy, and also why did you choose to make it for this specific people. So for instance, like the privacy regulation, you can be like, since there are already so many policies on the European level, it makes sense to continue having this European level instead of trying to have a policy for each country. But if it's something that is related to culture, for example, you can also argue that it is better to focus on one single country. And I, for example, choose the certification. So so it's also a type of policy, how softwares could get a certification when they meet certain criteria. So as I said, I focused on gender equality and AI, and then my criteria was based on the sample, on the data set the AI uses, but also on the design team, that it's a diverse team. And I elaborated on the criteria building upon previous existing policies and regulations. And also you also have to think about limitations and how to overcome them. So I already mentioned the diversity of cultures in the EU, but you can also, like in the case of gender equality, you can also be, one limitation is the definition of gender, and also should you have rules about parity so that it's mandatory to have 50% of women, 50% of men, or is it also okay if it's 60 or 40? So those are all like limitations that you can add, and if you have a solution, then put it there. But if you don't, it's still important to show that you thought about some limitations. And then in your conclusion, so you have to summarize the report and shortly explain again why this regulation is important. And you can also argue what the solution will bring. So I remember I said that by having search certification, people that are going to use the AI are also going to be more aware of the topic of gender equality in AI and the topic of bias. So that is why it's a good solution. So again, argue for the recommended tool. And yeah, that's all. I would just say to conclude that it's also very important to keep in mind that it's a policy brief. So you really have to go out of this mindset of writing an academic paper, and you really have to argue in favor of what you're giving. So you don't need that many academic sources, but you really need to be argumentative all along. So yeah, now we have a lot of time for questions, and I hope you have some, but just keep your cameras off because of privacy issues, since this session is being recorded. Like, yeah, we cannot have your face on it. And you can write the questions in the chat or unmute yourself, whatever you prefer. Even if you don't have any specific question, you can also tell us what you're writing about, and maybe someone is writing about a similar topic, so you can help each other. Are you guys still here? So there's a question in the chat. Do you think it is important to have a central policy as good, bad example, or more like overlook of the problem? I think you can go for both. If you have a very big policy and a lot of things to say about, for instance, the GDPR, you can really focus on the GDPR and see what kind of limitation it has, and then have like one solution to these limitations. But for instance, in my case, when there was not a lot of previous policies and no central policy at all, so that's why overlooking the problem was also easier to do. No problem.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, I decided for the topic of worker.
Any other question?
Can you hear me?
I'm not sure if the yeah, I can was for a question or. So, Ludovica, you decided the topic of worker conditions. Ah, yeah, sorry, we couldn't hear you before. But yeah, you decided to the topic of worker conditions in the gig economy, and is it better to focus on a specific country or Europe? Well, I'm really not familiar with the existing policies in that, but if they differ from one country to another, I would say it's easier for you if you focus on one country, and then, for instance, in the conclusion or in the limitation of your recommended tool, you could say that it would be helpful to have certain regulations on a European level. Does that make sense? Actually, I think my computer was muted. That's why I couldn't hear you, sorry. But if someone wants to use their microphone now, it should work. If there's no other question, we can close this session. I'm going to stay 5 more minutes in case you guys come up with a question. But for those who are all set up, you can go and go write your paper. Yes, I can share the slides. Maybe I can send them to you, and you can share them in the group chat or something. Perfect. Thank you. No problem. Have a nice evening.